For nearly 500 years, a European civilization lived where logic said it shouldn't. In today's episode, we uncover one of history's greatest mysteries, the Greenland Vikings. Welcome back to True World Chronicles, the place where forgotten histories, lost civilizations, and hidden truths come back to life. How did Norse settlers thrive in Greenland for centuries? Why did they refuse to leave, even as the climate turned against them? And what really caused their disappearance? Over the next 25 minutes, this video will reveal hidden facts, shocking theories, and overlooked evidence that may finally explain what happened to the Vikings of Greenland. This is a story of survival, pride, climate change, and a civilization that slowly faded into legend. Let's begin on the edge of the Arctic, at the mercy of ice, wind, and darkness. In a place where winter didn't just visit, it ruled. They raised cattle on frozen ground. They cut hay under a sun that barely lingered. They built churches of stone and wood, even a cathedral with stained glass, thousands of miles from Rome. They weren't explorers passing through. They weren't refugees waiting to leave. They built a society. And then, one day, they were gone. No final battle recorded in sagas. No mass grave frozen in ice. No ruined city preserved in time. Just empty churches, collapsed homes, abandoned farms, slowly swallowed by the land. For centuries, historians stared at Greenland and asked the same question. How does an entire civilization simply disappear? Some blamed war, others blamed disease. Some imagined pirates, raids, or violent clashes with the Inuit. Theories piled up, books were written, documentaries speculated, but none of it quite fit. Because the truth wasn't dramatic in the way people expected. There was no single catastrophe. What happened to the Greenland Vikings was slower than that, quieter, and far more unsettling. They weren't destroyed. They were worn down, squeezed year after year, by forces they could feel but couldn't stop. Climate, economics, culture, and eventually the sea itself. This wasn't an apocalypse. It was a long goodbye. And only recently, through ice cores, genetic studies, archaeological layers, and climate science, have we finally been able to reconstruct how it really happened. This is the story of how the Vikings of Greenland vanished. It begins, as many Viking stories do, with exile. Eric the Red was not a calm man. He was violent, impulsive, and dangerous enough to be expelled from society. Twice. First, he was exiled from Norway for murder. Then, after settling in Iceland, he did it again. When Iceland cast him out around the year 982, Eric had nowhere left to go. So he sailed west. Ahead of him was nothing but open ocean and rumor, whispers of land sighted by sailors blown off course. After weeks at sea, Eric reached Greenland's southern coast. What he found surprised him. Between massive ice sheets were fjords that cut deep into the land, protected from the worst winds. In summer, grass grew there. Fresh water flowed. The land wasn't friendly, but it wasn't impossible. When Eric's exile ended, he went back to Iceland with a plan. He didn't describe Greenland as harsh or dangerous. He called it Greenland, and people listened. In 985, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships across the Atlantic, packed with families, animals, tools, timber, everything needed to start over. The journey was brutal. Storms destroyed ships. Ice damaged hulls. 11 ships never arrived, but 14 did, and that was enough to change history. What the Norse built in Greenland wasn't a temporary camp. It wasn't a desperate frontier. It was a functioning European society, complete with law, hierarchy, religion, and identity. Over the next centuries, two major settlements took root, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. At their height, between 2,000 and 5,000 people lived there. They built longhouses with thick turf walls to trap heat. They cleared land for hayfields. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They built churches, more than a dozen of them. Eventually, they even built a cathedral. There was a bishop appointed by Norway. There were taxes. There were social classes. These people didn't see themselves as isolated or forgotten. They saw themselves as Europeans. And for a long time, the world agreed with them. The Norse arrived during the medieval warm period, a stretch of centuries when the North Atlantic climate was unusually mild. Summers were longer, sea ice was lighter, storms were fewer. Farming in Greenland was difficult, but possible. And beyond farming, Greenland had something Europe desperately wanted: walrus ivory. Across medieval Europe, ivory was more than a luxury. It was power. It was carved into religious artifacts, jewelry, chess pieces owned by kings and bishops. Demand was enormous. Greenland had access to it. Every summer, hunting parties sailed north into dangerous waters to hunt walruses on the edge of the ice. These expeditions were deadly. Men were crushed by ice, lost at sea, or killed during the hunt. But the reward was worth it. Ivory paid for iron, for timber, for ships, for everything Greenland couldn't produce itself. For centuries, this system worked. Then, slowly, the world began to change. Around the mid-12th century, temperatures in the North Atlantic began to fall. The medieval warm period faded, and the Little Ice Age crept in. Not as a sudden freeze, not as a dramatic collapse, just year after year of colder summers, longer winters, worse storms. Ice cores drilled deep into Greenland's ice sheet preserve this shift perfectly. They show falling temperatures, increased storm activity, expanding sea ice. For the Norse, the consequences were devastating. Their survival depended on hay. Hay fed cattle through winter. Cattle meant food, milk, leather, wealth, and status. Shorter summers meant less hay. Less hay meant starving animals. Starving animals meant collapse. At the same time, the sea turned hostile. Trade routes froze. Storms wrecked ships. Ivory hunting expeditions became longer and deadlier. This wasn't a sudden disaster. It was pressure, and it never let up. The Norse adapted, but slowly. Archaeological evidence shows the shift clearly. Early layers of waste are filled with cattle and sheep bones. Later layers are dominated by seals. Isotope analysis of human remains shows that by the end, up to 80% of their diet came from the ocean. They became seal hunters. But adaptation had limits. Greenlandic society was rigid. Large farms controlled by elites held the best land and most cattle. And cattle weren't just food, they were identity. To abandon farming entirely would have meant abandoning what it meant to be European. The Inuit, meanwhile, had mastered Arctic survival: kayaks, harpoons, clothing designed for extreme cold. The Norse knew this. They just didn't fully adopt it. They adapted enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. Historians call this fatal conservatism. As climate pressure mounted, the economy collapsed. Elephant ivory flooded European markets. Walruses were overhunted farther north. Genetic evidence shows tusks shrinking, animals weakening. More risk, less reward. Then came the final, invisible enemy. As the Greenland ice sheet grew heavier during the Little Ice Age, it pressed the land downward. At the same time, its massive weight pulled ocean water toward it. Local sea levels rose, up to 10 feet, not globally, but right where the Norse lived. Their farms flooded, hayfields turned salty, boathouses disappeared. Storm surges crept farther inland every year. The sea didn't attack. It advanced, slowly, relentlessly, until staying no longer made sense. There was no final moment. The western settlement was abandoned first. The eastern settlement lingered. The last written record is painfully ordinary: a wedding in 1408. After that, silence. Families left in waves. Some tried to reach Iceland. Some may have joined Inuit communities. Many likely died at sea. When Europeans returned centuries later, Greenland was empty. The Vikings hadn't lost a war. They lost the future. They survived for more than 450 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But climate change, economic collapse, cultural rigidity, and rising seas stacked the odds against them until survival simply stopped being worth the cost. Civilizations don't always fall in fire and blood. Sometimes they just slowly lose the ground beneath their feet. And by the time you realize it's happening, it's already too late. But Greenland? Nah, it didn't stay empty forever. The Vikings? Yeah, they dipped. But the land? It kept on living. While the Norse farms crumbled and churches went quiet, another crew was still holding it down. They weren't building fancy cathedrals. They weren't raising cows or stressing over changing the world. They just rolled with it. The Inuit. Way before the Vikings even showed up, Their ancestors already had Arctic survival locked down. They hunted seals and whales, paddled kayaks like pros, rocked clothes made from animal skins, and just vibed with the ice instead of fighting it. Where the Vikings tried to freeze Greenland in place, the Inuit just moved with it. Colder winters? No sweat. They changed their routes, shifty sea ice, they switched up their gear, storms, adjusted, kept going, and boom, they survived. And guess what? They're still here. Today, Greenland's got around 56,000 people. Most are Inuit, often called Kala-Alit, rocking that Thule culture heritage that's been around for like 1,000 years. They still speak Kala-Alisut. Their traditions are alive and kicking. And yeah, they know ice, sea, and survival better than anyone. On top of that, there are also descendants of Danish settlers who came later, traders, officials, and whatnot. Greenland now runs itself, but is still part of Denmark. So it's this cool mix of Inuit roots and European influence. Snowmobiles replace dog sleds in some spots. Sat dishes pop up where stone churches once stood. But the land? It's still the boss. Greenland never bowed down to anyone. It doesn't care about flexing or showing off. It rewards people who actually get it. The Vikings tried to force Greenland into their image, and slowly, they fizzled out. The Inuit? They let Greenland do its thing, and they thrived. Those old Norse farms are still buried under dirt, quiet reminders of a crew that just couldn't roll with it. But life? Life kept moving. Kids still grow up under that never-ending summer sun. Hunters still read the ice like a map. Communities still push through those brutal winters. Greenland never shut humanity out. It just picked the people who listened. And today, they're still here, living right where others just became stories.
Year by year, the cold deepened its grip. The settlements built with such hope slowly succumbed to the unforgiving Arctic silence.
In Part 2, we'll tell you why the US government wants Greenland. Connect with our channel.
True World Chronicles.